All right. So gonna get the recording underway here. And again, as always, we'll record this. It'll go on to YouTube, for again the people that want to see it who might not be able to make the time. So today we have Sierra. She works with lots of different folks from, kind of the sports nutrition side, from basically everything in between in terms of, kind of like getting yourself to feel better. Um, and yeah, I think she's got a wealth of knowledge. This is her third, I think, or fourth time presenting to kind of like the Mad Endurance crew of of people. So again, like obviously with the coaching company, we see lots of cyclists, stage racers, marathon runners, etc. And Sierra's worked with many of them of my clients. So we kind of work conjointly together in terms of like seeing, calorie requirements of the training slash the demands of their racing. And then Sierra's been able to basically build a intricate plan that kind of layers into the training that provides recovery for yourself, along with energy to be able to expend that, kind of large efforts that a lot of the races that we do demand. So, we're talking about stage races again, marathons, triathlons, and everything in between of big mountaineering. And Sierra's worked with kind of all kinds of athletes. And again, she also takes on clients. So again, if you're like this call will be speaking a lot of generalities, and there's not one single way to kind of split things up. So, if you're kind of listening to the call and having a hard time figuring out how it applies to you or how to integrate it, that's where Sierra specializes. And to the point of, again, all my clients ask me nutrition tips all the time. Again, I broad brushstroke it because Sierra's knowledge and depth with how food integrates with the body is just at a far superior level, and that's why I entrust her to take on those kind of needs from my clients. So, without further ado, I'll let Sierra take it away. And yeah, thanks again for coming, Sierra.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'm really, really excited to be here again. And yeah, for everyone who is like, we haven't met, I don't think I actually recognize any names. So I'm Sierra, and yeah, he did a really great job at introducing me, but I'm a registered holistic nutrition with a sports performance nutrition certificate. And then under that umbrella, I work with lots of people because again, sports is kind of like sports performance is what you're optimizing, but beneath that is kind of who we are as a core too. So I work a lot with gastrointestinal support, hormonal support, and all those things kind of in between. So I've prepared a presentation here today. Let me just get it all set up. And I'm going to do it side by side so the recording works well that way. And I'm going to pin myself just so it does film me. But yeah, we're going to be kind of talking about everyday nutrition, but obviously influencing some sports and specifically cycling nutrition into this. Obviously, nutrition is such a broad spectrum of what you can do and where you can start. So I'm really focused on, again, the generality of, well, what can we do if we haven't started or where should we be starting? And I like kind of showing this because, at the bottom here, the baseline part of nutrition is where we mostly live. Maybe you own a business, maybe you go to work, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're someone that is just living everyday life. And then the second tier, which you see in the middle, is kind of that's when you take the bottom being the generalized nutrition. You take the next level when you're trying to optimize, maybe you're a recreational athlete, weekend warrior, and you're looking at like, well, how can I, kind of optimize those areas in my sports? How can I help those areas? And then there's the top tier where it's like, okay, you're an athlete, you're doing events, you're an ultra marathon, you're doing multi-day stage racing. That's when you're optimizing performance and you're getting really precise. So I'm going to be kind of tapping into all three of these a bit today, but for the most part, I'm talking about where we live most of the time that helps those other top two tiers. Because if we don't have the bottom, we're not going to be stable at the top. And that's kind of where I want people to kind of think from is like, we usually are only doing a race or an event for 1 to 7 days of the year. So there's still 300 days where we're needing to have recovery performance, training energy, and overall just maintain health. So just so that kind of gives a bit of reference as what I'll be kind of talking about. Um, the next part here is just, I'd like to kind of tap into, sorry, I think there's a couple microphones on, so I'm just going to turn them off because they're, oh, you might have to do that, Kirsten. Sorry, you might have to mute some microphones. I think they're all right. The Energy Triage Center. So I think a lot of people too look at this as like on the left-hand side where we see the car, what we eat is going to exchange into the type of fuel. I've always said this before is like you're not going to put diesel in a gas car and vice versa. You need the right kind of fuel for your body, which means, yes, it goes down to gender, what you do for activity, age, all the things in between. And what you'll see on the other side is what we eat is going to translate into the other side. We can be getting calories, but it may not translate into what our body needs. And this is where I'm going to kind of go in depth of like nutrition and supporting ourselves. On the top, obviously, our autonomic nervous system is going to be what is essential for us to live. It's what we don't have to think about doing. If our brains, if we had to think about thinking or our heart to be beating, we would no longer be on Earth. And that is when it comes to those things just have to run, right? So that's our baseline survival. It happens for us. We don't need to think about it. The first to go, which often is what I start seeing clients with, is like they're noticing their skin is breaking out. They're noticing their nails are brittle. They're noticing they're having digestive problems. They're having reproduction problems, brain power issues. That is what usually starts going off when we're not giving our body the chance to have the right nutrients for it to be supported. So that's when, I look at kind of individuals as like, if these things are kind of coming up, the kind of first to goes, then there might be some sort of discrepancy, whether it be deficiencies, it could be a lack of energy, a lack of calories, or a surplus of things that aren't actually sufficient. So that's kind of where the energy triage center is. Those are the things that are going to go first, and that's usually an indication. So everyday eating, again, is like it doesn't need to be complicated, but it needs to be supportive. And so what we choose to put on our plate every day is food. Hopefully, that's going to keep our blood sugar stable. We need to have a positive insulin response. We need to make sure that insulin resistance is going to be supported and support our hormones. So this is our sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, thyroid, stress, cortisol, all those things. These are kind of the supportive areas of our body that nutrition is going to be directly and indirectly supporting. Systemic inflammation, maintaining lean mass, cognitive clarity and function, protects our tendons, muscles, and joints, aids recovery from our exercise and training, and benefits our sleep. The reason why this is kind of the bigger picture. What we put on our plate is like little puzzle pieces to the big puzzle. And over time, again, if we're making choices that maybe aren't aligned for what our body needs or our training style or what we're doing day to day, or even, again, like sleep is such a huge part. But if our sleep quality is not really great, because I'll use an example of you have young kids or work stress is keeping you up, those areas need to also be supported through nutrition. And that is one of the best ways to do so. So, talking about everyday nutrition, these are the things that are really needing to be supported. So I'm going to kind of just hop right in and talk about the basics of macros. I think majority may know, some may not know, but I think again, it's really important to understand them. And this is coming from a generalized view. So again, this is not what you're doing on race day. This is not what you're doing for specific training. This is more generalized. But carbohydrates are a primary source of fuel, right? So they are a primary source. Our brain uses it. We absolutely need it to do basically every single function in our body. They matter because our brain and our body primarily will run on glucose. If you are training, which I'm going to assume most people here are, we need glucose to move. We need it to function, and we also need it to preserve our muscles because carbohydrates need to be in the presence of protein for muscles to actually recover. So, low carbs diets, specifically if we're training, tends to increase our stress hormones just due to that high stress response. Now, there's obviously different ways people can do it. I'm not going to touch on keto. I'm not going to touch on those things because that's not what I'm touching on today. But there is always different paths to get to places. Primarily, this is definitely something that carbohydrates need to be present in someone's body for the most part to support longevity, to have those nutrients kind of run through them. So, everyday intake, especially if we are implementing some training techniques as we gear into kind of spring and heading towards some events, it needs to be moderate to high and it needs to be consistent. We can't just focus on one high carb meal and then low carb meals in between, or skipping meals and just not having, again, focusing on one macronutrient like just protein or high in fats, things like that. And the sources need to be rich in nutrients and slow digesting. So what I mean by slow digesting is there's different types of carbs and there's always different types of choices depending on if it's used for training or single day to multi-day events. But I'm talking about everyday nutrition and the baseline of recovery support. So more going for those carbohydrates that have different bonds, which is going to be the bran, germ, husk, all attached. That's going to be brown and wild rice, sweet and yellow potatoes, whole grains, things like that, berries, honey, banana, papaya, watermelon, foods that have, hydration. So I always suggest like my clients focusing, especially with or in and around training and as we go into warmer temperatures too, is lots of fruits that have lots of hydration. So like it could even just be like watermelon has an incredible amino acid, help for replenishment and repair for our muscles and our body, and simple sugars to kind of access that. Pasta and bread. So again, type depends on activity. The reason why I put this here is because I don't suggest that people that go into training are going to have a whole bunch of whole grains to slow that down because it'll take too long to get into the body. But for every single day, like before you go to work and you're having a breakfast, like whole grains is the way to go because they attach that nutrient that's going to aid in that recovery, aid in that blood sugar stabilization, aid in the good bacteria for your gut microbiome. Beans, lentils, and oats. So these are kind of like the superior classification of like the focus carbs, right? Um, Again, majority of people need to be kind of aiming towards that 50 to 60% of building their calories from carbohydrates this way. I kind of talk a bit about that more later on, but it's a good kind of rule of thumb. And it's definitely a huge part of it. And then there's protein. So maybe because I'm just part of the protein wellness health world right now, but it's kind of got this weird glamification of everyone's reaching their protein goals. And I think it's a really good trend to kind of be highlighting, but it also is not the only trend. And it is really important to look at it through the lens of what does protein actually do and what sources do you actually need to focus on? So protein is there as your building blocks of your body, right? It's we basically are walking protein and fats and water. And we need to have enough amino acids that are circulating through our body at all times throughout the day to support just general everyday life. And then especially if we're someone who is training or as we lead up into any sort of event. We need to have those amino acids not only just to help protect our body, our tendons, our muscles, our joints, but we need them also for the function of, again, muscle replenishment. And especially because if we're talking about more endurance events and stuff like that, not losing muscle mass to the point where it becomes an issue again for performance and things like that. So daily target, again, meeting your range. Again, the threshold for everyone is going to be slightly different based on what you need, but I always like to say there's that 0.8 to 1.2 per pound of your ideal body weight. And I say this because if let's say you're a 350-pound individual, you're not needing 350 grams of protein. You're needing what an ideal healthy BMI weight would kind of categorize you in. And that's just where that discrepancy kind of comes from a bit. So the best for protein and again, assimilation, muscle synthesis, and recovery after is eat enough at every meal. So again, if you're an endurance person, you're going to have a higher muscular burn. So you're going to probably need more protein than the average sedentary person for sure. And you want to spread it evenly across all meals. That is going to be the best for recovery, the best for assimilation, and the best for absorption purposes. There's a couple of things I always like to touch on here too, is making sure you have enough is really important. It's even more important than making sure you have that 30-minute window afterwards, after like a training or something. Mostly because if you have circulating protein in the body, your body generally knows what to do. And that's just some of the latest research that I think is really fascinating. But your optimized time to have protein is that 30 minutes windows after. So again, that's kind of speaking to training. Just generalize hitting your protein amount every day is still the kind of like top tier here. And it matters, again, like muscle loss happens during high activity. But even if you're not super active, maybe you're coming off an injury, maybe you're someone who's just kind of thinking about getting to training, we have to think about protein as like the preservation for our connective tissue, the preservation for our cognitive function, a stabilization of blood sugar. So I've spoken to a lot of people too, especially if they've been training a lot. I'm sure, Karsten, you could probably speak to this a bit, but the chews, the gels, the increase in glucose that actually occurs during those periods, on the literature afterwards is sometimes those types of individuals and those athletes, they have a very unstable blood sugar just due to their uptake of glucose and actually that's what's been retained in cells. So it's interesting because this is why recovery in general nutrition is so important, is it brings you back and it brings you back faster and it brings you back to that recovery kind of baseline to make sure that all other areas that like let's say after a big event may kind of occur and you need those recovery nutrients gets you back to kind of feeling good. Oop. Um, Everyday sources, so whole eggs are a great protein source, and whites are primarily protein. So kind of again, depending on what you need to build a healthy plate as far as your amounts and needs, whites can be primarily the kind of focus for protein. Dairy, so yogurts, kefirs, cheeses, things like that, rich in calcium and protein, so good replenishment, especially for certain athletes. Fish, so especially white fish tends to be more lean source protein. Fatty fish is going to offer the same amount of protein, but also with some healthy omega-3 fatty acids. So different kind of macros, both incredibly nourishing for the body. Poultry, so lean poultry, chicken breast, turkey, and red meats. So grass-fed red meats is something I would encourage for most individuals to have. We're looking at like a once a week, once every 2 weeks kind of rotation. And venison, bison, beef, all those things are really good at that kind of amount. Especially, I think I'm speaking to mostly a male audience here, but again, especially for women, we're looking at iron and even for men as well, like looking at iron panels and stuff and seeing kind of what nutrients we need to get from where. And then there's soy and legumes too, as more as like the plant proteins and stuff. Fats, so macronutrient of fats, again, it's a hormonal production. So again, not just speaking to, I think again the word hormone is really thrown out there lately, but I'm more speaking to sex hormones at this point because when we're uptaking any kind of amount of intensity, we can say, I'll use again aggressive training or events that kind of occur, our sex hormones do tend to do a little dance and not the favorable way, just because our stress on our body is higher and therefore triumphs over sex hormones. So when I do share kind of this knowledge, especially with a male dominant audience, I'm usually speaking mostly about testosterone and supporting those. Fats are the kind of anchor for our recovery. So the right type of fats matter. And where we're getting those sources of fats are crucial. So we need to make sure we're having fats that are actually going to contribute to more of an anti-inflammatory diet, not promote too much inflammatory response for sure. So I always say focus on what you need to have more in the diet, not so much what we can't have. So monounsaturated fatty acids, amazing source. Those are going to come from mostly olives, olive oil, avocado oil, almonds, Brazil nuts, pumpkin seeds. Brazil nuts and pumpkin seeds are also really incredible because they're rich in, there's two trace minerals. There's zinc and selenium. So those again are kind of really supportive for testosterone. And then omega 3s, so fatty fish, hemp seeds, flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds. These are not the only fats to focus on. These are what you need to focus on for the bulk of your fats. And I always say that because there's going to be saturated fatty acids that come from chicken thighs, that come from grass-fed meats, things like that. Not a problem. This is just more what you want to focus on, and usually where people end up having less and focus on more of an animal prominent diet. And that's where you see that kind of research come out from is what's dangerous, what's not. No, we need to look at kind of just having enough of these for recovery. Again, I think calories is kind of a conversation that's very subjective to each person. I do recommend, and hopefully everyone here kind of knows a bit of a baseline. People have Garmin watches, like any kind of fit watches and stuff. That's a good place to kind of see a perhaps approximate of what you're burning daily. And how much is enough, right? Because daily needs are totally based on stress, but more so weight, height, age, gender, and activity level. This is going to change through the seasons. And I think it's really important to know that because, in just kind of previous experience, when people are like, I heard I was supposed to have 2,000 calories, that's pretty like archaic generalization for people. And so, what I've noticed, especially with people who are training in any kind of endurance style, is that they're massively under eating or under training, or sorry, under eating for what they're training. So again, this may need to change as the seasons go on and things change for you. So adjust according to the intensity and duration of your trainings and find that baseline that is like your majority of every day and then add on top as things intensify. So I do encourage people to kind of have some sort of tracker just to kind of see and monitor. The reason why it would change again is going to be based on if you have a watch, it usually does it for you. But like, when you are training, what effort are you training? Is it in zone two, three, four, or five efforts? That's going to change to your metabolic burn that's going to happen during and after. Is it leisure? I think you can definitely take two individuals and they can go for a walk, and one's going to set a different pace and do it with a little bit different intensity. That person's probably going to be burning more. Same goes for biking and same for other things. So, again, kind of just like keeping your eyes on the effort. It's very different what someone does with 30 minutes of their time. Length, is it an hour? Is it 4 hours, one day, multi-day, and then the baseline. So kind of what I was talking about. Your starting place of calories, that's what I'm considering your baseline. That's kind of your everyday. That's your recovery days. That's the days you're not really training. And then kind of focusing on glycogen storage levels as you amp up training, focusing on more of those carbohydrates to replenish, and then making sure you're hydrated. Those are kind of like the kind of parts of calories and stuff. And um, oh, what's going on here? And then we have like again our brain fuel connection. So if we have low, and I always kind of like to explain this more in like the low carb version. Again, I see lots of people, lots of individuals that are training, even if you're not training again at this time, people are often under eating. So if we have low carbs, that means we have low glucose and we have slower reaction times, which means we have lower motivation and a higher perceived effort. So, meaning we need to essentially have enough carbs circulating in our body at all times, especially if we start picking up more training, to be able to have these things supported, motivation, reaction time, all that stuff. Low protein, so not having enough protein in your diet, definitely the risk that comes from that is it's going to be low in certain amino acids. And so this, I didn't even put in here actually, there's amino acids that are really supportive for muscular growth as far as just preservation and recovery. Those are going to be leucine, isovaline, and valine, I believe is the last one. Those are going to be the ones that are really supportive for, again, preservation of muscles. And primarily they come from, I think, again, in kind of the wellness industry, whey protein is one of the best sources just kind of for that as far as how it can support your recovery. But not only just those, it also, if we don't have enough protein, that means we don't have these other incredible amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, that support our dopamine and serotonin. When people start amping up training, they're going to any sort of event. I'll use a one-day event as an example here. Those are things that we need to cultivate because it is, our brain needs to have that mental endurance. We need to be thinking, we need to be on, and we need to stay motivated. And accountability, as far as what we put on ourselves, starts with food. There is definitely a training aspect 110%, but the food is what is going to be the driving factor to even how we're going to think or want to show up. And then even, again, as the fats, if we don't have all these kind of healthy fats in our diet, it just causes more of an inflammatory environment, especially as, the season kind of amps up here. So just remember, like the brain runs on glucose and protein, amino acids, and fat. So for underfueling, which surprisingly is more common than overfueling, it is gonna kill our performance both mentally and physically. And at the end of the day, we can put training from an endurance standpoint on this pedestal, but we can also put just showing up for everyday life, right? So it's how we show up for ourselves and on. Supplements is a pretty big category. And so I want to stay really basic here because, again, I think it's speaking to a general, but these are the ones that commonly come up. And I speak to it more in relevance for people who are training and more curious as far as that goes. So, supplements that are low that I would say are more of the generalized supplements too. Iron is a huge one. So, especially again, for women, it's typically quite a bit higher, but even for men. So getting routine blood labs, I would say twice a year is something I would highly support. It is crucial for oxygen flow around the body, nutrient intake, dopamine synthesis. So again, that mental and motivational standpoint. Vitamin D. So if you are anywhere that is, yeah, I'll use Pemberton as a good example. It's a valley, it gets like two hours of sunlight. It is probably common that you have lower vitamin D, but I do encourage people get tested because it is a fat soluble, so it stores in your body. Knowing your data is extremely important, right? We don't want to go off of how you feel or what was told online because online's really noisy. We want to see data so we can actually like supplement appropriately. But if you don't have enough circulatory vitamin D in the body, that is going to mess up so much stuff. So as we go into spring, we're looking at, okay, well, we need to make sure that, again, mood, cognitive function, hormonal function, all these things are being supported, and vitamin D is commonly low. Electrolytes. So again, hydration is probably one of the biggest things that I experience in conversation with my clients is like hydration. You just got to stay hydrated for so many reasons. And sometimes in the winter months, it's harder because we may not feel as thirsty as we do when we're either, sweating and training more in the summer, but it's equally as important. So, if you're someone that has salt stains when you train, if you smell musky after you train, those are pretty good indications that you're probably losing quite a bit of sodium. So electrolytes are a huge supportive. They're not only just supportive for, everything in our body, I would say, but neuron signaling. So again, if we're trying to like, change gears or brake and stuff over time, and I'll speak to more of a racing aspect here, but it's like we need to have those muscle functions. And the amount of clients I've worked with where they're like, I just kind of seized up. That's usually an electrolyte imbalance, and that's usually dehydration. And so we can be drinking 3 liters of plain water and still be dehydrated. And that is the difference between are we actually retaining hydration? Are we getting enough trace minerals in our water? Or are we just flushing things out? So lots to talk about there, especially in the training world, but I'm just assuming that everyone here has a threshold of activity, and it could be in the mountains right now, but regardless, it is something that we still have to pay attention to. And I would say a supplement is usually very helpful. B vitamins are another one because B vitamins are really, there are stress and energy vitamins we need. They basically help support break down carbs, proteins, fats. So they're essential for ATP access. I kind of talk a bit about that with creatine and stuff, but it's really, really essential. So if we don't have enough of those B vitamins, and then they're also supported for our stress vitamins, which again, if we're putting our body under any sort of perceived threat, which training, events, all those things are a perceived threat on the body, we're probably pretty low in them. And they're water soluble, so we excrete them through sweat. So people that are highly active and are sweating quite a bit typically have lower Bs. And so I always suggest supplement with vitamin B complex is going to be really helpful. And then I want to talk about performance ones because these are the ones that are usually glamorized in the marketing world, and there's very good evidence that they could be highly supportive, but they're also, again, subjective to each person. So protein powders, what I was talking about before, the amino acid, the leucine replenishment, again, it's just the best for muscle growth and preservation. It's what's commonly found in whey products. So protein powder can be a really easy way to help replenish with that 30-minute window after you do some form of training. And I would say for most part, like even going back to that pyramid I was showing at the beginning, if you are even just slightly above the everyday living kind of life, protein and protein powders can be a good option for you, especially if you're struggling to meet those protein demands, because you're putting your body under usually quite a bit more stress than the average person. That is the term supplementation, is to supplement what your body's not maybe getting from everyday life and to supplement that to bridge that gap. BCAAs are different than protein powder. And I would say if you're meeting your everyday protein goals and you eat a pretty well-diverse diet, especially in recovery nutrients like you're getting chicken and fish and eggs, you probably don't need BCAAs. They're essentially the three amino acids that are the best for the muscular build. So again, the leucine, valine, isovaline. The only thing I will say to that though is that if you are someone who struggles to meet their protein goals and you are doing a high amount of training, BCAAs could be helpful for that reason. I prefer focusing people to help have that generalization of nutrition covered before I would suggest BCAAs. And then even therefore, I would say protein powders are probably the next. But just because it is a common question and it is in the endurance theme, as far as should I take this? Should I not? I wanted to bring it up just to kind of share that context, just in case you are curious. Creatine, I'll use this as an example because again, is next to protein, creatine's having this wild mo movement right now. So it's probably a curious question from some. It is definitely a great option for people to incorporate in their diet. However, it first was studied more extensively with strength training and different types of training, and it is absolutely still supportive for people who are endurance training. Now, the reason for it is slightly different. It is still going to be able to support your ATP access, which is essentially going to be that like stamina, endurance, performance, all of those kind of areas is we need that access to be accessible to us. But it is not for everyone. And if I'll talk about it in a different slide, but it is definitely something you want to go for a clean version of monohydrate, creatine monohydrate. That's the only one you kind of want to get. Do not have gummies. They typically are not going to be helpful. Only go for the powder form. But it definitely could aid and help with muscular recovery. Now, it's something to play around with. It is not going to make or break performance, but essentially what creatine does is it essentially will pull water to your intramuscular cells, which is like what people, I think when it first kind of came out is like, it's going to make you jacked. Not necessarily, but what it does is it pushes the muscle outwards because it's going from the inside out and it draws water. So my only discretion here for people who are playing around with supplementation is if you are not well hydrated, focus on that first because it is pulling water. And so when I've been working with clients now, I'm seeing people that are even more dehydrated. They're dealing with GI stuff coming up. It's because they're implementing these supplements that are helpful because of one kind of part, but they need to focus on the baseline nutrition of hydration, a good diet, and all these other areas. The last one is beetroot. I love beetroot. I think it's a really simple way to kind of get some micronutrients into the diet, considering it is also food form. So you can get like beetroot concentrates. And you'll commonly see it in like pre-workouts or some sports blends for sure, because it helps with the nitric oxide that it has it present. It helps with oxygen flow, nutritional flow, which is only going to help performance and recovery. So most people will suggest take it before you're doing any kind of race or training or kind of workout, and that will aid in better recovery and performance overall. Again, I think it's really important to keep all of this in consideration that these are to supplement already a well-rounded diet. I kind of briefly talked about this, but our supplements for you, and I use the creatine kind of example on the bottom. It definitely is an individual need. I'm a food first, supplement second, but I know this is a common nutrition conversation, so I wanted to talk about it. Your daily activity is going to dictate what you need. Your hydration levels are going to dictate what one you need to kind of be on or not have. Medication is a huge one, so always do your research if you're on medication, if a supplement is right for you. And also your health concerns, right? Because as they change or evolve, maybe Suzanne over here is low in iron and maybe she needs iron, but it doesn't mean that her husband needs to be taking it. And this is why supplements are really hard to kind of give general nutrition advice because everyone is slightly different and needs different things at different periods. So I kind of talked about it before, but an example is an individual with any digestive concerns. I'll use IBS or GI instability here as an example. It actually can be really hard on people who have a low-key digestive issue just because, again, it pulls water. And I wouldn't suggest necessarily for people dealing with this to do any kind of loading phase. And I suggest this because it's the same with gut adaptation and taking chews and taking bars and taking things when you're training. You need to give your gut time to adapt. And some people fare well with chews all day long, and some people are in a ball next to their bike. And it's just one of those things where it's like we need to listen to what our body is responding with, and sometimes we need to tailor down. It doesn't mean it's not as effective, it just means that it's right for us right now while we adapt. Um, and building your everyday plate. So kind of, bringing it full circle back to like, okay, how can you kind of build your plate, right? I think it's everyday plates need to be simple. They can still be absolutely delicious, but they do need to be kind of founded in simplicity to work. Especially if you're gearing up for any event. I'm always like, stay consistent, for that month prior. Keep it simple, stay consistent, you will see results. When we're talking about even Olympic training and stuff, when they go to have food prepared, it is literally rice and chicken. It is like rice and chicken, and they'll have some sort of veg that is really non-offensive to the gut and no bloating kind of reaction, right? So again, you don't need to train like that top tier pro athlete, but again, it depends on how far you want to take it. So for your everyday plate, you can definitely play around with carbohydrates again that are going to trickle down and keep blood glucose stable. Again, kind of hitting that 50 to 55. I even say you can go upwards to 60 depending on your training if you're doing more. Sweet potatoes, oats and honey, wild rice, whole grains, fruit. Those are great carbs, kind of keeping that locked and loaded for a month, rotating them. It's a great kind of option. Proteins, 20 to 30%. Again, kind of examples here. Fats, again, very simple. Nut and seed butters, olive oil, walnuts, hemp seeds. And then the micronutrients, while they don't have their own category as far as macronutrient goes, they are considered micronutrients. So they indirectly give us energy, meaning we're not going to have broccoli and have a bountiful of energy. That's not really what they're there for. It's not their purpose. Their purpose is to help your gut microbiome, help good bacteria, they're also there to give you micronutrients from vitamins, minerals, fats, and antioxidants. Sorry, not fats, enzymes and antioxidants. And they also are there for, again, performance because these are the parts where they help our endocrine system, which is our hormonal system. They help our gut microbiome actually stabilize, which, especially with endurance athletes, there's people who deal with a lot of digestive issues. And it can be for many multifaceted reasons, but a lot of it does come down to the stress on the body that's maybe occurred from training and needing to refeed bacteria. So again, broccoli, cauliflower, like all those kind of vegetables and stuff that are kind of light, those are great additions on your plates. Jazz it up, add spices, make sauces. You can definitely make sauces like peanut butter with some soy or tamari and make a chicken rice bowl with some broccoli. It doesn't need to be wild, it just needs to be simple and it needs to kind of stay within these kind of categories. When we start getting like any sort of response, when I'm working with people and their bodies kind of not enjoying these foods, it's more so based around like an individual reason, if that makes sense. And then around building everyday nutrition, you have to build your everyday habits because they're indirect nutrition. So again, focusing on sleep quality. I weave this into my nutrition because it is definitely going to help how you're going to assimilate your nutrients. Recovery is a huge part, right? I'm sure Karsten, you'll definitely agree, is recovery is non-negotiable. It is just what you need to do. actually to help sleep quality, which I think is really fascinating. And again, it kind of rejects whole diet culture that's happened, but we need complex carbohydrates at our dinner. It will help with our sleep. That's where we're going to have most of our tryptophan. It's going to be most of the melatonin producing foods, great foods to kind of help with sleep at night if you're someone who does struggle. Uh, there's good examples here, but peanut butter, like a small amount, not a wild amount. Bananas actually have tryptophan. So again, if you're someone who wants like a half a banana with some peanut butter, that's great. Oatmeal, tart cherry juice. Some people warm up tart cherry juice and that'll actually help because it has melatonin. And like a little bit of yogurt. Those are kind of great, easy, light digestible as long as they're within a reasonable amount, nothing too, large. Totally fine, great for sleep, and will actually help. And then complex carbohydrate dinners, I always share because sometimes people say, I ate really healthy, I had a salad for dinner. But then they're waking up at 3 and their blood sugar is hungry because they may have stabilized it at dinner, but if they are an active person, their body probably doesn't have enough glycogen accessible to have a well-rested sleep. And so I always say have complex carbohydrates at dinner. It is something we need to focus on. Less water in the evening. If you wake up and pee a lot, just don't do that. It'll interrupt it. Doesn't mean you don't drink water. It means just don't have all your water at dinner onwards after work, because I talk to a lot of people and then their sleep's interrupted. And then supplementation again, individualized if you need. Hydration levels. Yeah, don't need to talk too much about that, but it is just a huge part of just maintaining overall health. A huge part in nutritional flow too. So again, if you deal with any digestive stuff, one of the biggest screenings is, are you drinking enough water? And are you drinking enough water that has minerals to actually retain that? And then the eating schedule. So it's actually something that is really important, but imagine going to work and not knowing what you're doing for the day. You're going to feel a little nervous and you're probably going to feel quite a bit anxious and you're not going to feel like you have that confidence to show up. So it's the same thing with our digestive system. If we're someone that sometimes has lunch, sometimes doesn't have lunch, sometimes we have a snack, sometimes we have a huge, we go out to eat. Our body needs routine to signal the proper hormones and function. And this specifically comes into play, I mean, at all times, but specifically if we're training. It needs to know when we're getting our next meal, and it's essential for circadian rhythm. So if we're someone who does have a sleep that's impacted, and we're eating late at night, that is probably a good place to start as far as sleep quality. But the same goes for kind of mornings, like again, there's different information out there, but for most people who are within like a pretty high intensity day to day, I would say the best thing to do is to have meals steadily throughout the day that are founded in health and whole foods, that I was kind of sharing today to help stabilize blood sugar and also give your circadian rhythm the right response. So food, eating schedule, try and eat at the same time every day and track and adjust as needed. And then kind of lastly here, as far as just like, talking about it, because I know I'm talking to a lot of people who do have training, either currently or upcoming as far as what they want to do. And nutrition makes or breaks endurance performance 100%. So again, endurance performance is really based around your availability as far as fuel goes, your availability as far as nutrient goes, your gut tolerance and your recovery. And that is 100% starting with what's on the plate. Because training is just a part of our day, whereas nutrition, we're faced multiple times a day. It is something that we have to make the right choices often, which is why it's the hardest. It is an obstacle that we all face more than I think we want to. But when we start to feel better and more confident with, oh, it's improving my performance and improving these things, it becomes really non-negotiable. Um, Bonking, again, it's not a sign of mental weakness. I've talked to a lot of people who are like, I just didn't do well. I look at that as like, okay, we're looking at maybe too low a calories, under fueling, a glycogen depletion, electrolyte imbalance. Those are the areas I'd rather focus on than you yourself are not good enough, because that is typically where it actually stems from. People who just are under fueling for what they're doing. And a lot of endurance athletes, like I said, they're under fueling and specifically carbs. And carbs, yeah, I mean, Kirsten, so. That's kind of my presentation here. I'm going to stop my share and take my pin off. Uh,
Yeah, and just maybe to highlight a few things that really kind of stand out to me is that, this stuff is not something you just all of a sudden, 2 weeks before your event, you like are flipping the table and starting from scratch. Like you want to be building your root, like what Sierra's saying, routine, to the point of like the simplicity of eating. Like, yes, on the top end, like I used to say, I ate like a dog, like just very same, easy. I knew what I was gonna get from it. Um, and don't get me wrong, there was still, again, sometimes racing surprises you. Sometimes what you planned for in terms of a duration all of a sudden balloons because stuff out of your control. I've had it where I got pointed, the whole race got pointed off course, and all of a sudden, yeah, you're now like didn't bring enough calories and you have to start making smart choices. But anyways, not to digress too much, but yeah, like the getting into the habit, because then what you'll start to see is like with the training is like, is this amount of calories helping me get through my training? Because back to what Sierra's saying, where she has clients that, talk about bonking, I have the same thing with some of my clients where, I'm watching their training come in and I can see it dive off in the back, kind of last quarter of the workout. And when I start asking like, hey, what did we intake, on this, race like session. So when I say race like session, I'm talking threshold, VO2 max, like really pointed efforts. And it's like, yeah, I had some electrolyte in a bottle. It's to me, it's like, well, where's the carbs? Of course, in the back quarter, like I'm surprised you made it that far. So it's kind of that, yeah, carbs, carbs, carbs. And so in terms of the, what you eat in your daily life, that's an all the time thing. But also then what you're putting in your training bottle should be a carb rich drink. And then again, the other thing that really just stands out to me is you can do all these things, and this is, I think, training. I think eat like digestion, food, all of it, it's all great that you're going to do all that, but if you're not willing to sleep and sleep well, you may as well just, again, like we're talking about starting points, like sleep, hydrate, like there's one and two, get those right. Um, and then, start kind of mining away like at the small things because you don't want to get into like starting to mine out marginal gains when there's just big glaring massive ones. And sleep is, I'd say, the priority number one. And I kind of figured that out in the back end of my career, not in the front end. And I wish I would have found that sooner. But yeah, so want to keep the kind of some time for questions. We've got just over 10 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask Sierra while she's here right now? Um, Please feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and have a chat. Anyone, anyone? Okay. Obviously, it was a thorough presentation.
Yeah, I feel like I cover a lot. And again, I wanted to keep it really generalized, just kind of based on what we were talking about, Karsten. Just keeping it simple.
Yeah.
But there's always, like, kind of going back to that first slide, is like there's always what we can do to optimize the next steps. And so, because I'm assuming that most people are training, there's training nutrition, that's the next step of what actually do you need to be looking at training wise. I also think it's like, again, like Karsten, when you track your clients and you see that they're dropping off, like carbohydrates are 100% of the time what's to kind of be talked about there.
Hmm.
And kind of talking about today and like everyday nutrition, this is also what builds you up for those training sessions, right? This is what is going to help your recovery. And I just saw a question come in.
How
So
much of protein powder slash shakes should you add as your protein daily intake?
that's a good question. So again, I think it bases on what else you're eating. So what you need is based on what you are eating and what you're not eating. So as an example, let's just say you need 200 grams of protein a day. We'll just say. Um, and you're able to get 140 grams through Whole Foods. considering that you're having breakfast, lunch, dinner, and some snacks. Well, then it looks like your shake will probably equivalent, and that would equal 200. I'll use an example, and this is a real example that I come into kind of conversation with a lot of people is people don't eat breakfast, right? So now there's 2 meals a day. You have to get in your 200 grams of protein essentially, which becomes really hard and often, if you are able to achieve it, digestively challenging. So that's when I say people who are training, especially at a threshold like this, like for many reasons, I would encourage don't skip meals. Do not, because what you're skipping is nutrients. You're skipping micronutrients. So to kind of come back and answer your question more clearly, it is based around what you're eating and needing. I would say focus on your whole foods first to get about 85%, 90% of your protein intake. And then the protein powder, consider it kind of what you're adding on just to top up. Top up with those amino acids that are directly going to be supportive for muscular recovery. You also don't necessarily need to have protein powder, but it is helpful, especially if the threshold of training is higher.
So
Uh,
another question from Nadia. Uh, do you have do you have some healthy carb examples? Yeah. Do you have some healthy carb examples that you could just throw out?
Yeah, so just kind of like saying, kind of like if you relate and didn't see the first kind of slides, like anything that is going to, so there's lots of different healthy examples of carbs, but I'll talk about the ones to have for the most part, meaning not around direct training or recovery necessarily. Whole grains, brown rice, wild rice, sweet potatoes, yams, yellow potatoes, looking at also oats, raw honey, like things like that, fruits. Those are going to be great source of carbs. Anything that's whole grained and has fiber because that means that it's going to help stabilize your blood sugar with a fiber that's going to be intact. It has more nutrients because it's usually coming from a colorful hue or a whole grain, which is going to have, again, the nutrients that are going to kind of still be present. And it'll be slow releasing, so it won't disturb blood sugar insulin response. When you would want to have more simple carbohydrates, not quote unquote what people would say, especially in society, as far as healthy carbs, white rice and sourdough bread and pastas and stuff are really efficient in direct training or event periods. Not so much for what we're talking about today as recovery and general nutrition.
Eric has one looking towards a 3-day mountain bike stage race this summer. What dietary recommendations do you have for recovery and fueling during the event? I'll just start with the top part and I'll let you take it from there. But
Yeah.
probably the biggest thing what I learned coming from being a single day racer going into stage racing was that the first stage race I did, I tried to eat like I did single stage racing. So what Sierra's talking about, like this very simple, like pasta, like,
Yeah.
and ultimately near the end of that stage race, I felt like absolute garbage. I didn't even really want to eat anymore. So it was a big wake up call that it was like, whoa, I can't in a stage race eat like I was. I have to try to adapt and eat how I was during like a hard training period of,
Mhm.
where you're still living normal life. Whereas, yeah, on a single day race, you kind of eat really, I call it like trashy carbs. So, Sierra, take away on the back end of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty well answered that. I think when it comes to dietary recommendation, it is about listening to your body and kind of what Karsten was saying is there's a difference between a single day and a 3 day. You don't want to have this, and going back to the glucose response I was talking about is after a multi-day stage race when people are doing chews, bars, high carb diet that's coming from refined sources, glucose response in their body is actually not great and not very stable. And that is again just what some literature has kind of said. So when we're looking at, okay, well, what are these athletes kind of needing and what would you need? I would still focus on making sure you're getting a variety of nutrients. You don't want to have anything that's too hard to break down, but you need it to be founded in good options. So what that looks like is still having your recovery meals. Make sure you're bulking up with like, again, like sweet potatoes, avocado, lean proteins, and getting majority of your carbs coming from still like oats, honey, fruits, things like that. Don't have it directly before your race or during your race, of course, but you definitely want to make sure that those are your recovery nutrients on the back side of things. So it doesn't mean you have to be eating white pasta and white rice and bananas for 3 days with chews and bars and a bunch of stevia filled drinks. You need to have those other nutrients to support that. I think and I don't know, Carson, we haven't talked about this, but if you're hosting some form of event training and during event training class at some point, are you?
Sorry, re
Yeah, no, for I didn't know if you were doing a seminar on the training day, like kind of what we did previously, like race
Oh, yeah, yeah,
day.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry. Yes.
No, so I think that might be answered more fully in there because it's not really just a one question. Like I think Kirsten, you answered it pretty good. It's like just the recovery kind of around it. But there is a lot more to what a multi-day stage race nutrition would look like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Jamie Skinner here, following up on carbs. What can you recommend for the most rapid intake? Example is for an after work high intensity session and you haven't had carbs since lunch.
First, I would say you probably need more carbs either right before your training session or during if it's super high intense. If you feel like you're pretty stable and you didn't need that, and that's just going based on your response in your body, I look at, okay, well, let's do a smoothie with some banana, a protein powder, and a date or some honey. Because that's going to be the simplest way to kind of get carbs. It's a pureed, again, version. You're basically breaking it down and pre-digesting it into more of a smoothie form in that sense. And you're able to kind of get that into your body as quick as possible. The two things you don't want to have directly after a high intense session when we're looking at carb or protein replenishment is anything that has fiber or fats in a large volume because they will slow the gastric emptying, which means our muscles and our body won't be able to actually replenish as quickly. So that's why I said banana, protein powder, some yogurt, like something like that, and kind of just get it into you as quick as possible if that's how you feel. But I would also look at, again, if you are training at 5 or 6, let's say that's when you're training for work, and you haven't had carbs since lunch, I would look at having something before your training session, potentially, depending on how your body responds.
And um, are headaches in recovery a clue for any particular nutrient insufficiency? That's Nadia again.
Yeah, lots. The first thing I'll just say common electrolytes, making sure you're still well hydrated. Headaches are really, really common for that. Iron. Iron's the next one for headaches and promoting that because if we think about how iron works, it's basically again red blood cell oxygen and kind of flow around the body. So we're looking at um our brain not receiving that. So headaches are a huge one, and depending on your threshold to training, that can definitely decrease that. So those are kind of the top two that I would start with. And then there's always other areas to go to if those are totally fine.
Hmm. Yeah, agreed. Um, any last questions? Those are all great questions so far.
Yeah.
Okay. I think then, yeah, we'll kind of wrap this up. And so again, big thanks to Sierra. Um, there'll be obviously a follow-up. And, again, if you missed something in this, the session is recorded and will be on YouTube. So you'll see me follow up in a newsletter, with it, the link and stuff. And then for reaching out to Sierra, you can find her through my website and or her own. I'll on the newsletter have a link to her website as well, so anyone can again chat to her. I know she does consultation calls, and you can kind of see how things can fit in for you. And of course, as well, again, we kind of can work hand in hand. So if you need a training program that's a little specific, reach out to me as well. And yeah, we will have another lunch and learn next month on the first Tuesday, which what date does that make it? That makes it April. Oh, no, hold on. April 7th. So April 7th will be the next one. And yeah, so thanks for your time, everyone. Appreciate it. And again, thanks, Sierra.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to be on. Thanks, everyone.